Good evening and welcome to the Harvard Art Museums and this evening's program, Productive Disorder, Music, Film, and Art in Postwar Germany. My name is Maya Swazomaller, and I'm a junior in Winthrop House studying history of art and architecture and computer science.
And my name is Lily Calcanini, and I'm a senior living in Dunster House, and I study history and literature. Maya and I are members of the Harvard Art Museum's Student Board and are delighted to welcome you to the museum on behalf of the student community.
Please now be sure to turn off your cell phones and help us to warmly welcome Kate Rentschler, who will introduce tonight's program.
Welcome, everyone. It's so nice to see everybody on maybe our first semi-spring day. That was very nice today. So my name is Kate Rentschler. I'm a PhD candidate in Harvard's Film and Visual Studies program. This semester, I've been a curatorial graduate student intern at the Harvard Art Museums, assisting with programming related to the special exhibition Inventur, Art in Germany, 1943 to 1955, which is on view now in the Special Exhibitions Gallery on the third floor. The first exhibition of its kind, Inventor examines the highly charged artistic landscape in Germany from the mid-1940s to the mid-1950s and features photography, collage, photo montage, drawing, painting, sculpture, and commercial design from this period. For those who have not had a chance to see the exhibit, the gallery will be open following the roundtable until 8 p.m., and we hope you'll be able to head to the third floor to explore the show. So in this roundtable discussion tonight, our speakers will think through an expanded field of aesthetic production in Germany in the post-war moment, putting the realms of art, music, and filmmaking into conversation with one another. Our first speaker tonight is Lynette Roth. Roth is Daimler Curator of the Busch-Reisinger Museum and head of the Division of Modern and Contemporary Arts at the Harvard Art Museums. Her research focuses on modern and contemporary art from German-speaking countries, with special emphasis on the medium of painting, the relationship between art and politics, and the history and reception of German art in the United States. She's curator of Inventor, Art in Germany, 1943 to 1955. So I'll welcome Lynette.
Great, thank you so much, Kate. And welcome, everyone. As Kate mentioned, I curated the exhibition that we currently have on here at the Harvard Art Museums, and as I was thinking about tonight's talk, I came across a slide I had actually used several years ago during the Carpenter Center for Visual Arts summer summits, where curators and artists are invited to talk about their travels and how it relates to their work. And I actually thought it was a great way to kick off our theme of productive disorder, which is what we titled our roundtable talk tonight. Productive disorder is one of the terms that's been used to actually describe the art of the immediate post-war period in Germany. And as this map of Germany shows, and actually looking at it now, it's actually not complete. I even visited even more cities in Germany related to this exhibition project. But you can see the incredibly dispersed artistic production that required travel to various destinations across the country. Of course, the country was divided after the Second World War into 4 zones of occupation, and by 1949 into East and West. And that is really that kind of binary between East and West and between realist and abstract art has really come to be the lens through which we view the art of Germany of the 1940s and early 1950s. And so in the exhibition Inventur, my aim was to move away from the centers we tend to think about when we think about German art. Nowadays, we focus primarily on Berlin, and really make sure that I was paying necessary attention to cities across Germany and artists working in those various cities. It's one of the unique qualities of the art of the immediate post-war period, and I think the fact that art production was taking place in these very dispersed pockets. Artists were forming their own local artist groups. Communication between different parts of the country was very difficult. It's actually been one of the reasons why the art of the immediate post-war period in Germany has received very little attention to this day, certainly in the United States. It's sort of difficult to kind of begin to wrap your mind around what that production looked like. So the notion of productive disorder, I thought, was quite fitting, not just for the myriad art production that was happening across the country, but also thinking about our guests tonight, who will take us to a deeper dive into film and music as well, and complement very much the focus on the visual arts that you will see in the special exhibition. The exhibition Inventur takes its name from a poem by Günter Eich. Günter Eich wrote the poem Inventur in 1945. You can both read it and hear it in the original German in the exhibition upstairs. And he counts his sort of meager belongings in a POW camp. And it's really become one of the most significant sonnets from the immediate post-war period, and in some ways came as to be a sort of stand-in for this 1945 moment. In the exhibition, I pair that poem with this drawing by Kurt Kverner. Kurt Kverner was a critical realist painter who in the 1920s and early 1930s was actually an extremely political artist, and laments then in 1946 when he is drawing this still life of his stool in his POW camp after the war, that what he is now he finally has the materials to make art, and what he's turning his attention to are these kind of bourgeois affairs, the affects of everyday life, the stool, the bed that he sleeps in, the cans of food that he eats from. And I've seen, I saw actually as I was preparing the project, this notion of inventur, or a kind of inventory or stock taking, as a very helpful way for thinking about the period as a whole and the art of that period. One of the other images, and I'm very grateful that we have Professor Rentschler here with us tonight, one of the other images that stayed with me very much as I was preparing the project were these two film stills from Allied footage of Berlin in 1945, where we see a woman within her apartment, kind of going about her daily tasks, paying attention to the objects of everyday life as if there were four walls surrounding her. And one of the major themes of the exhibition and of the art of the period is actually this kind of destabilization between the public and the private, the interior and the exterior space. As Germans, after the war, living amid the destruction, are both destabilized within their everyday lives, but also very much in their sense of self. I'm very drawn, of course, to a lot of images from the period which show Germans also salvaging those very domestic items from the ruins. So here in a photograph by Richard Peter Senior of two women salvaging chairs from the ruins. And artists as well were equally as likely to be found salvaging items from the ruins in order to create their work. And one of the themes that defines this period is really one of material scarcity. We see that, for example, in a work by Jeanne Mamen, from around the end of the war, where she has actually taken wire from a Soviet bivouac near her home in Berlin and used it to create the outlines of these two profiles in a work that's untitled. Jeanne Mamen left most of her work untitled and undated. And she is a key figure for the Inventur exhibition, partially for that reason, because I make in the exhibition an argument about the continuity of a lot of these artists, how they continued to work during the war, and after the war, and are really the ones, as they are the artists that stayed in Germany, who defined the art of the immediate post-war period. Just a teaser in case you haven't been upstairs. A lot of the work in the exhibition revolves around this idea of inventory, artists working in series, artists creating like Hermann Gluckner, sort of recreating work that had been lost during the war. This is a sculpture also from around 1945-46 that Gluckner does to recreate an important artwork of his from 1935 that he had lost during the bombing of Dresden. So you can see inventory is not just, the act of the exhibition, sort of taking an inventory of the artists of this period, but also artists doing their own inventories, looking to what was lost, recreating, and trying to sort of create a continuity between their pre-war, wartime, and post-war practice. I mentioned that the incredible sort of diversity of the period came also from the fact that artists were working all across the country, often in isolation from other groups, at least initially. Artists were also working in a range of media. So inventory functions very well for thinking about the art of the period because they are also looking back to pre-war practices, their own practices, as in the case of Gluckner, or here in the work of a young artist who's emerging in the immediate post-war period, Brigitte Maschinski-Denninghoff, who is living in Berlin and showing her work in this exhibition of a group called Zen 49. We can see her working in a range of different materials, sculpture, relief, drawing, and she's really basically trying out all kinds of different media as a young artist trying to find her footing. And in fact, a prominent art critic at the time, Will Grohmann, referred to the period as being one of a lot of confusion. So again, this idea of productive disorder, right? So it's kind of hard to figure out or put our finger on sort of one singular movement or style. And I think that's also been something that's made this period very difficult for scholars, unlike the work that emerged in Germany after the First World War, where we can really see a revolution of forms. We can kind of point to a series of movements or isms. In the immediate post-war period, it really was this very disorderly, kind of confused pulling together of styles and forms. And that's something that I really point to in the exhibition by including work in a range of media and really bringing together all of those media in the individual galleries in order to point to the vast array of production that is going on at the time. I should add that pluralism in Germany was championed by modern artists also because a unified aesthetic had been that promoted by the Nazi regime, right? So to work in all different kinds of manners and all different kinds of media was inherently understood as a democratic practice. And I think something, too, that it's important for us to remember that as these artists are actually emerging from the Nazi period and working in the aftermath of the war, they are doing so not only trying to reestablish their own practice, but they're also trying to reestablish their role in society and garner attention and support for their work from a public that was indoctrinated by Nazi propaganda. So a lot of the work that we see in the exhibition, including a work like this by Werner Helt called Still Life at the Window from 1950, really brings together a lot of these themes. We see him both referring to a kind of cubist style. He's thinking about Berlin, where he lived. We're positioned between the space between interior and exterior. This is part of a series he did called Berlin at the Sea. He believed that sort of everything that man creates, including architecture, would eventually return to nature. So he's an artist who begins this series actually in 1940. So obviously it's also a kind of wartime thought about the destruction and also the destruction of civilization. And a lot of that kind of work, I should mention, in the scholarship up until this point has been referred to because it has this kind of what could be seen as a more eclectic style, as artists are really establishing their own style. In fact, Held actually turns with this painting increasingly towards abstraction. The art historical scholarship has referred to it largely as kind of eclecticism, kind of half-modernism, a kind of quasi-modernism. So you can see that there is this kind of, has been this kind of way of thinking about the work that has not seen it as being as forward-thinking as I certainly argue it is. Here we see Werner Held in his studio. Most of the artists working at this period did not have a lot of funds or support for their work, as they had not. This is an image of Jeanne Mammen during the war, working in her studio in Berlin as well. This sense of isolation continued largely until after the war, and then we begin to see artists putting on exhibitions. This is a photograph from the Gallery Gerhard Rosen, the first gallery to be founded in Berlin after the war, artists are hosting the exhibitions of each other's work also to encourage the public to engage with modern art. They're also forming groups. This is a photograph of the so-called neo-expressionists in what was called the Room Gallery in Frankfurt. A lot of times the galleries themselves were actually private spaces. This is actually the living room of the dealer in Frankfurt, where these artists came together for their exhibition. So again, this notion of public and private, and what actually is a kind of art for a public, and where is the public in a lot of the work that's being produced. And just quickly to wrap up, another major theme of the period is the relationship between art and industry. Something that's actually been a criticism of the work of the period is that artists began to collaborate, especially in the 1950s, as we see the emergence of what's been called the so-called economic miracle in Germany. Criticisms, including most famously by Günter Grass, that the abstract art of West Germany was like so much wallpaper. And I actually decided I would sort of turn that on its head and actually put wallpaper in the exhibition and point to the fact that a lot of these artists were actually coming out of a Bauhaus tradition, a tradition around the turn of the last century that actually did not see that division between art and commercial design. And that many of them did also accept commissions from industrial and commercial ventures in order to document a lot of the new products that were being produced in Germany, like in this photograph by Ruth Hollensleben of artist wallpapers produced in the mid-50s. Whoops. Sorry. And we end the exhibition with the Documenta in 1955. Documenta was the exhibition that has pretty much then put German art of this period on the international map. And Documenta did tend to focus on the art primarily of abstract painters. It was a West German production, and so eliminated altogether East German artists. It did show work by contemporary artists like here Willy Baumeister's large Monteru, which is in the exhibition upstairs, together with international artists. But it left out quite a bit of the artistic production that was going on in Germany still at the time. And so the aim of the exhibition was to in some way sort of recuperate some of those strands of artistic production, which included a lot of work by women, and also artists working in smaller scale media and media such as collage and certainly photography, which has kind of fallen out of the narrative of this period. And finally, I will end with the photograph that we selected for tonight's roundtable discussion by Arnaud Fischer. It's called West Berlin from 1956. For the notion of productive disorder, I mentioned that with the division of Germany in 1949, we often began to look at this period through that kind of binary lens. And Fischer is an exceptional example of an artist who continued to work between both East and West Berlin well into the 1950s. And this is a work from his series Situation Berlin, of which there are several examples in the exhibition. And we see also in 1956, that Germany is still very much a rubble city. And of course, the ruins will be a major theme tonight, I anticipate. But when we think about Germany's kind of economic miracle of the 50s, we have to remember that Germany in the 1950s is not America in the 1950s. And we can see that in Fischer's work of this period as well. So that's just a very brief overview of the diversity and plurality of the visual arts of this period. Thank you.
Thanks to Lynette. So I'll now introduce our second speaker. Amy C. Beal is professor of music at University of California, Santa Cruz, a music historian and performer. Her work specializes in American music and 20th century music. Her many publications include the book, New Music, New Allies, American Experimental Music in West Germany from the Zero Hour to Reunification, published by University of California Press in 2006. So I'll invite Amy up. Thank you.
So we'll pick up with another ruin here. This is the city of Darmstadt in 1945. Though the final months of the war had been catastrophic for Germany's cultural infrastructure, budding initiatives soon reestablished a lively new music community throughout the country. West Germany's commitment to new music began immediately after the end of World War II during the so-called Zero Hour. First-hand descriptions of Germany after the surrender, both during the Zero Hour and the subsequent chaotic time during which most cities lay in ruins, emphasized that culture was essential for spiritual survival, possibly more crucial than the need for food, water, or coal. An art historian living in Berlin after the war recalled that art and music helped heal broken spirits. Erich Hartmann, a double bassist for the Berlin Philharmonic Orchestra, provided an eyewitness account of Berlin in mid-1945. He wrote, "One of the miracles of this period was that despite all of the unfortunate circumstances in the bombed-out cities, attempts were made to continue cultivating culture even while most concert halls, theaters, and cinemas were destroyed." In a diary entry written in November 1945, Hans Speyer described the abundance of bookshops on Heidelberg's Main Street and their window displays with books on musicology and scores by Bach. He also noted, "Everywhere in town one finds announcements of concerts, theater performances, and recitations." Appealing to an American audience in the magazine Modern Music in January 1946, another eyewitness wrote that artistic life had been paralyzed long before the end of the war, but had been boosted rapidly with the help of the Western Allies. After the surrender, he wrote, "Hardly any opera groups or complete orchestras were left, nor were there any theaters and concert halls usable because of heavy bombings during the last months of the war had destroyed or badly damaged most buildings of any size. In spite of this, artistic life had picked up rapidly, thanks chiefly to aid from the Allied occupation forces. In several large cities, symphony orchestras and opera companies now give performances. The radio stations of the military governments have become artistic centers, especially in the American zone. And the Amerikahäuser also were cultural centers of renewed musical life. Two cities emerged in the immediate post-war era as particularly important to the rebuilding of a new music community in Western Europe in general, and West Germany in particular, Darmstadt, which you saw before, and Cologne. Cologne reflected several unique political, historical, and cultural factors. Unlike cities hosting noble residences like Darmstadt, Stuttgart, or Karlsruhe, Cologne remained a working-class town on the Rhine River's industrial waterway. Home to foreign-born composers like Cornelius Cardew, Maurizio Kagel, and George Ligeti, post-war novelists like Heinrich Böll, and to political aesthetic critical thinkers like Heinz Klaus Metzger and Hans G. Helms, Cologne also maintained a strong link to modern art through its galleries and museums and its connection to the Art Academy in nearby Düsseldorf. Westdeutscher Rundfunk, or WDR, the single most consequential radio station for new and electronic music, dwelled in the heart of downtown Cologne and housed the early experiments of Herbert Eimert and Karl-Heinz Stockhausen. The artist and gallery owner Mary Bauermeister studied art in Ulm and Saarbrücken before returning to post-war Cologne, her hometown. She belonged to the generation of German artists, writers, and composers who, after the war, found it unacceptable that the, quote, old continuities should just go on. Bauermeister cited the terror of war and post-war trauma as a chief influence on the creative life of artists her age. Even in the mid-1950s, she recalled, she and her contemporaries still experienced the daily effects of the war despite accelerated economic growth. And as we just heard, throughout West Germany, in fact, destroyed buildings, ruins, and rubble remained visible in public places well into the 1960s. Drawing a connection between stylistic trends in visual arts and the catastrophic years of her childhood, Bauermeister explained that, quote, when we were children, we saw a world break apart, destroyed by bombs. Cologne remained only as bricks and large piles of rubble and mortar. Everything that used to have a form was now broken. No houses stood anymore, so we didn't trust them anymore either. So we started over from scratch. The war's real and symbolic destruction of the past reduced social and aesthetic barriers to uninhibited experimentation. Some scholars suggest that John Cage's music was particularly apt in this context, since many young European artists that felt his work began from a tabula rasa stance appropriate to the artistic impotence felt by many Europeans after the war. In this context, American music's lack of tradition had certain advantages. But Bauermeister was only 11 years old during the Zero Hour, and her need for a fresh artistic start was also influenced by the cultural landscape of West Germany during the 1950s, a landscape dotted not only with the old continuities, as she put it, but also with new artistic methods. Radio stations quickly mobilized as agents in support of these new artistic methods. In November 1947, Northwest German Radio, the predecessor of WDR, initiated what they called an experiment, a late-night program for more demanding topics than the average popular fare. 3 nights a week, the program served up hard-to-digest topics, music, and text that required a highbrow appetite. One magazine called the night program's offerings intellectual delicacies. In Cologne, the composer Herbert Eimert produced a musical night program that aired on Thursdays from 11:15 until midnight. And this is an image that was in a cultural magazine at the time of someone enjoying the night program. Soon, a generation of Germans and other Europeans seeking access to new music after the war delighted in Eimert's radio classroom. In November 1952, Eimert gave the first radio show in Germany on John Cage. Cage's attempts to minimize personal expression through the use of chance operations, his reflections on the nature of silence in a noisy world, and his experiments in simultaneity spoke to those who believed that artistic production as it had existed before the war was neither appropriate nor possible. In this climate, 12-tone music and serialism, total serialism, and pure electronic music flourished. Pierre Boulez, in his early 20s at the end of the war, later said, quote, in 1945, nothing was ready and everything remained to be done. It was our privilege to make the discoveries and also to find ourselves faced with nothing, which may have its difficulties, but also has many advantages, end quote. There's a widespread feeling among music scholars of this era that serialism, a systematic pre-compositional way of ordering musical parameters like pitch, rhythm, dynamics, and articulation, and others, was a welcome way of avoiding specific content or references to reality. This method picked up where pre-war serialism had left off after being banned for 12 years, along with other entartete Kunst, or degenerate art. In post-war European music, subjective expression of real experience was uncomfortable at best in a climate of such widespread destruction. The logic of pure numbers and acoustic facts available via electronic media were preferable sites for creative exploration. The city of Darmstadt and its famous summer courses, established in 1946, became a major center for this aesthetic. Serial organization in music reflected, perhaps, a compulsive quest for stability and structure following a period of worldwide chaos. Musicologist Richard Taruskin has written that 12-tone and serial music was viewed by many as a symbol of uncorruptible purity because of its essentially formalist nature, dealing only with the purely musical relationships of structure. Furthermore, total serialism now offered an escape from both expression and subjectivity. Similarly, he suggested that pure electronic sounds offered an additional option for retreating from reality. He wrote, "The neutrality of synthesized sound, its freedom from worldly associations, constituted its chief appeal," end quote. Interestingly, as some of you may have heard last week at the concert, at the same time, French composers Pierre Schaeffer, Pierre Henry, and others used recognizable real-world sound sources for their experiments in magnetic tape manipulation. Karl-Heinz Stockhausen's Gesang der Jünglinge, completed in 1956 and widely considered one of the first masterpieces of the post-war era, represents a combination of new compositional methods of the time: manipulation of magnetic tape, in this case a taped singing voice, pure electronic sounds synthesized at the WDR studio, and techniques of total serialism, the isolation and then reorganization of independent musical parameters. The piece also pioneered the idea of multi-channel tape and surround sound, which I hope many of you heard. I heard it was quite a remarkable event. And this is an image from the premiere of Gesang der Jünglinge in the WDR concert hall in 1956. Though some scholars have interpreted Stockhausen's choice of text from the biblical book of Daniel to be a veiled reference to the Holocaust, one could also argue that the sound of this music is neutral and abstract. Certainly, its compositional techniques are formalist to the extreme. I'd like to close by mentioning one glaring exception to all I've just said about the post-war search for purity, logic, and expressive neutrality, namely Arnold Schoenberg's composition, A Survivor from Warsaw, composed in 1947. And this is a self-portrait. Schoenberg was also a painter. The Viennese Schoenberg had been in exile in the United States since 1933, the same year he ended his 35-year conversion to Christianity and returned to the religion of his birth, Judaism. With texts in English, German, and Hebrew, this 7-minute piece for narrator, orchestra, and men's chorus remains today almost unbearably shocking in its unwavering focus on the fear, pain, and terror of a concentration camp. Though Schoenberg was widely recognized as the inventor of the pre-war 12-tone technique that led directly to stylistically abstract post-war serialism, he chose to set A Survivor from Warsaw in his early 20th century musical language of expressionism, a style known for its atonal assault on the ears and for its psychologically disturbing subject matter, often focusing on deprivation and cruelty. The piece's powerful conclusion is a 12-tone men's choral setting of the Hebrew prayer, Shema Israel, and here it is foreshadowed near the beginning of the piece as the old prayer they had forgotten for so many years, the forgotten creed. When A Survivor from Warsaw was given its West German premiere in Darmstadt, of all places, in 1950, it clashed directly with the implicit new post-war order: logic versus expression, numbers versus experience, abstraction versus reality, an eager hunger for the future, a reluctant digestion of the past. Thank you. And actually, I just wanted to mention, when I was preparing this, I made up a timeline that I thought I would use in the talk, but it seemed like it would just take too much time to go through it. But I have photocopies of this. If anybody's interested, I'd be happy to give you one afterwards. So, thank you.
It's fascinating. So I'll welcome now our final speaker, Erik Rentschler. Erik Rentschler is the Arthur Kingsley Porter Professor of Germanic Languages and Literatures at Harvard University and one of the foremost scholars on German cinema. His numerous publications concentrate on film history, theory, and criticism, with particular emphasis on German cinema during the Weimar Republic, the Third Reich, and the post-1945 and post-Wall eras. His most recent book is titled The Use and Abuse of Cinema, German Legacies from the Weimar Era to the Present, published by published by Columbia Press in 2015. So welcome, Professor Rentschler.
Good evening. I take great pleasure in being part of this symposium tonight, and I'm actually very pleased by Lynette Roth's project, going back to a period in art history that, for the most, is not thought of terribly highly by critics, and in an act of, I think, excavation and an act of discovery, has gone back to this period and actually made some really remarkable finds and actually made us rethink altogether this sector of art history. Now the question is, what happens when you try to do that with film? The odds are very, very much stacked against you, because between the years, let us say, 1946 to 1962, West German film is seen as really a dead zone, really a place where no films of any particular note are made. 1,200 features, between 1947 and 1960. Very few of them of any lasting importance, claimed critics. The cinema they claimed was, mindless, escapist, utterly bound up in popular genres, very much out to make a quick buck, but nonetheless hyper undercapitalized and very much a function of a situation in which very few things had changed since the Nazis had been in power. So this period that I'm talking about, between 1946 and say 1962, is sandwiched between Nazi cinema, which is, in anyone's mind, the most problematic period of any national cinema, a cinema very much that is a function of ideological state apparatus, and then that grand notion of new German cinema. We're going to have films by Wim Wenders very soon. He's really one of the guiding lights of that particular constellation, together with Rainer Werner Fassbinder, Werner Herzog, Alexander Kluge, Margrethe von Trotta, a good number of very significant art filmmakers. Now, so this period, seen as one in which film as an art does not flourish, that you have no filmmakers of international regard. If you mention names like Kurt Hoffmann or Wolfgang Staudte or Helmut Keutner or Bernhard Wicke, doesn't sound like it probably rings many bells in many minds here, and surely doesn't resonate in the way that the names of, say, Andrzej Wajda or Federico Fellini or Michelangelo Antonioni or Satyajit Ray or Ingmar Bergman, all of these international auteurs who were making films in the 50s. The comparison, in a sense, does not come out very much in German favor. So this is but there's a couple complicating factors, because it's remarkable that the films of the 50s in Germany are inordinately popular, that they are at the box office in really bringing in grand returns. This is a cinema that is loved by audiences but hated by critics. Now, and the situation is seen to be so dire that in the year 1961, at the German Film Prize ceremony, not a single film receives a prize for the best film of the year, because no one considers any film worthy of any recognition. So in 1962, you have this watershed moment where 26 young filmmakers appear at the Oberhausen Film Festival and read a manifesto and declare the old German film dead. And that old German film is precisely that period under discussion. So, as I said, the odds are stacked pretty much against this period in film history. How can one do the kind of work that Lynette has done with art in the case of film? Well, that's going to be the drama of my talk tonight. And see where we can go. So let's back up. Let's look at the first minute of the first film made in post-war Germany, made in 1946, the first feature film. This is Wolfgang Staute's The Murderers Are Among Us, Die Mörder sind unter uns, 1946. It came out in the fall that year at the same time that the Nuremberg trials were being conducted. This first shot is remarkable in terms of the way in which it's mapping a situation. We get the tilt up from a grave, or what looks to be a grave, but we also see a pipe there, a suggestion that, in a sense, not only has the city been razed, the infrastructure has been decimated. And we see this figure walking down the lane. It's one of these archetypal Heimkehrer, people returning home from the war. So we have a situation here that sets up a kind of temporal drama. That is to say, there are the marks of the past, and that past has brought ruin. There's marks of the present, this soldier returning home and trying to find his way into a life. And we have also the markers of a potential German future, the children running in and out of the ruins. You can see here to the left of the image here, this use of atmospherics as well. The rubble is prettified and stylized. And there's a whole larger dialogue actually in the post-war period about how do you represent rubble and what is a responsible way of doing that. This film came under a lot of criticism for somehow prettifying the rubble. But let's stay with the drama here. And you'll notice as you're listening here, there's music that doesn't seem to be matching. Right, this honky-tonk music, and you don't know really where it's coming from. Is it part of the space that we're seeing here, or is it somehow what we call non-diegetic? That is to say, not part of the fictional space. Well, hold on, and we'll see. This character, whose eyes are, in a sense, unfocused. He's looking down, he's really not looking ahead. More signs of the devastation here. So this turned then, and we mystery solved. That space where the music is coming from, this kind of honky-donk place, Tanz, Stimmung, Humor, dance, ambience, good humor. And he's going to escape into that space. And actually, in some minds, you can read this actually as an allegory for the subsequent course of German film history in the post-war era. That escaping from the rubble, escaping from the world of destruction, escaping from the harrowing memories of that past, you escape into this site of good cheer and escape. And for many critics, this space that is going to be entered here is the space that cinema of the Adenauer era occupies. It's a generic cinema, it's a popular cinema, it's one that really doesn't want to know about the pressing issues and about the haunting past. And so what are you going to get instead of that? Well, let me move ahead here. This is a clip from a film of 1954, Der Förster vom Silberwald, the forest warden of the Silver Forest, the warden of the Silver Forest. It's a so-called Heimatfilm, a homeland film. So you escape the rubble, you regress, you go back into history, back to a notion of an intact community in spaces that have not been devastated by falling bombs, where villages are intact, where communities are in order, where there is a notion of a somehow life that can be lived. 300 of the 1,200 films, feature films made in Germany during the 1950s are of this order, Heimatfilm. And you can imagine the inordinate compensatory power they had for people who were, to a great extent, homeless, people whose houses had been ruined, people who had lost loved ones, people who felt that they were in a state of anomie. This is why I think critics are so harsh about German film of the post-war era. That this is a kind of escapism that is regressive, that is taking you back essentially to a space that we know well from Nazi cinema of blood and soil. And that blood and soil had been a regressive space that had always distinguished between those who belong and those who do not belong. You wondered how I'm going to make a case for taking this era seriously. It seems like I'm leading myself into a cul-de-sac, but give me a chance here. There is a way in which you can say that the early Rubble films will be left behind rather quickly. And when we'll go into this era of a homeland film, the Heimatfilm, and that will, to a great extent, lead to this very powerful and appealing and, well, popular box office phenomenon in Germany. So, but what else do you have here? Well, critics recently, and critics of a younger generation, have said, hold on, there's more to it than that. That, as a matter of fact, there's a lot of modernism to be found in film of the Adenauer era. There's a lot of experimentation to be found. You just have to look in the right places. People have, and beyond that, these films are not as affirmative as one would believe. There's a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of the uncanny. There is a feeling, in a way, if you look at these films, that a lot of them give you a sense of Germany as a place inhabited by the undead and by memories of violence. That this is a cinema with lots of trauma and lots of resentment and lots of craziness. And this, I think, came to a head, actually, this new reading by a younger generation. This is not the generation of '68 that was looking back on its parents' generation and somehow passing judgment. This is people born after that, born in the 70s and 80s, and looking back at this period and saying, actually, what these films show us is a Germany that's unsure of itself, that has lots of appareils and abysses, and in a sense, it's a much darker cinema, and for that reason, a much more interesting cinema, because it's so full of aberrant and unruly energies. And let me give you a couple of examples of how you can see that in these films. Let me just give you an ad from the period, a very interesting one. Okay, you start with an ad and it says, "What good is a lovely facade if behind it you have a pile of rubble?"
Hinter ein Trümmerhaufen liegt. Auch das ist eine schöne Fassade.
That's a lovely facade as well.
Etwas Rouge, ein schön gemalter Mund. Was nützt es, wenn die Zähne ungepflegt sind?
But what good is that if their teeth are rotten?
Dadurch wird so manche Illusion zerstört. Der sogenannte Wert aufs Äußere aber setzt stets ein gesundes Inneres vor.
The desire to have, a lovely exterior is, of course, also of a piece with the notion of a lovely interior. So you have, rubble teeth here. I mean, in a sense, the past somehow being part of one's body that one wants to somehow, refurbish, just as you would refurbish a house, just as the these quickly built new buildings in the Neubauten in post-war Germany were ones that were meant to somehow cover up the rubble. Well, this is a rather strange ad, if you ask me, and it's of a piece with many, and actually, I think the question one might ask is, where are you going to find modernism? Where are you going to find avant-garde experimentation in films of the 50s when there really is very, very little of it? Well, it takes place in actually commercials, takes place in industrial films. And a lot of very interesting examples of that. And let me give you one. This is a remarkable piece from 1955 called Through Night to the Light by Hans Fischer. And it's an ad for Unterberg bitters. But hold on to this.
Unwohlsein und beruhigt.
Well, that's probably the most disturbing liquor commercial you're ever going to see. But I think what is going on here is something that you find in a good number of films of the period, where I talked about the notion of a haunted cinema, about people at night who can't sleep, who have harrowing kind of premonitions, things that somehow truly haunt them and lead them, and then that compensatory moment at the end where some sort of consumer article is supposed to somehow relieve that sense of angst that one has here. I think the point is this, that if you start looking at these films not just simply as vehicles of affirmation, but look at them in a way in terms of the kind of fantasy work that they're doing, the kind of compensations that they're offering, but also the kinds of fears and worries that they're responding to, you're going to find in them, and I think that's what this younger generation has managed to do, you're going to find them in a very provocative and very unsettling, but I think for that reason all the more interesting, and actually even at times formally striking cinema. It reminds me of a phrase from T.W. Adorno's very important book, Minima Moralia, where he talks about the post-war world as one that's inhabited by the undead. And in a certain way, when he talks about West Germany, he talks about it as a kind of phantom republic, that it's kind of a world of zombies. And there's this famous sentence, very short sentence from that work, where he talks about a situation where das Leben lebt nicht, life does not live. And I think that that notion then of a space where life somehow, what is the proper life? How can one live well? How can one live well with the burden of the past that somehow one is carrying around with one? Let me show you one final clip. I think it's the most remarkable experimental feature made during the 1950s. It's entitled Jonas. It's by Ottomar Domnick, a truly remarkable, very independent figure, very much someone who still is to be discovered improperly, I think, regarded. In any event, the narrative, in short, is about a man who was plagued by a sense of shame and guilt and also anxiety. It's a film that is striking for its use of electronic sound, a jazz score by Duke Ellington. It is very much one that is using the former arsenal of the Weimar Republic, and in any case, it's a truly a remarkable film. I'll be showing it in the series that I've put together at the Harvard Film Archive next month, one of the 5 films. It's the last one, and it's really the highlight.
Wenn Sie nachts durch die Ladenstraßen gehen, zwischen erloschenen Schaufenstern, durch ausgestorbene Passagen, denken Sie daran, dass hinter den dunklen Gläsern, zwischen den Spiegel und Magazinen ein Mann steht, einer, der nicht weiß, woher und wohin. Irgendeiner an irgendeinem Abend, ein Mann namens Jonas.
A man who doesn't know where he's come from or where he's going. A man named Jonas. One figure of many interesting figures in this cinema of the 1950s. Thank you.
Great, well, thank you both so much. I feel like there is so much we could talk about. I'm going to start by just asking a few questions to get us started, and we hope that it'll develop into a bit of a conversation, and we'll also open it up to questions and comments from the audience as well. So I'm going to start with you, Rick, and sort of thinking about this notion. You very pointedly made the differentiation between, the 1962 moment as the moment where, there was considered to be a rebirth of German post-war cinema, and in that declaration by this generation of 1960s filmmakers, the immediate post-war period long sort of fell out of the narrative until you kind of pick it up and you mention a sort of new generation of scholars. And I'm curious, we know those powerful figures because their work is so compelling, and I think we see the same thing happening in the visual arts, right? We have in the 1960s Gerhard Richter and Sigmar Polke and Georg Baselitz, and they're basically also declaring the work of their teachers and predecessors, sort of moot. Why do you think it's taken this long? Is it really just a sort of generational shift, or has enough time passed, or why have those arguments so impacted the canon until recent years, do you think?
That's a depressing question, because I wrote about the films of the 50s a lot, and I said the same things, same critical things about it for a good long while. So when you asked me this, I asked myself, why did it take me so long to come around, in a way? Because it's strange how a certain kind of new impetus can sensitize you in ways where you just watch films you thought you knew well, and all of a sudden you realize you haven't seen them. That somehow, now, to answer your question, I think on the one hand, there was that inordinate, well, the case was strong, and I think the strongest, aspect of the case against the cinema was that it was tainted by the Nazis. That in 1960, 70% of all films made in Germany were directed or scripted by people who had worked under Goebbels, worked in the Third Reich. That any number of films from the Third Reich were remade using virtually the same scripts, with very little refurbishing. That the legacy of the UFA studio continued on into the 50s. I mean, surely not as glorious, but nonetheless, in a number of ways, still trying to carry on with that notion of the well-made film, that generic cinema that really counted on stars to somehow to drive it, to energize it, to, in a sense, make it worthy at the box office. I think that notion, that heroic notion then, and it's a notion that also is mythic insofar as that 62 moment where this collection of young men, and it's only men, say, Papa's cinema is dead. The old German film is dead. We are going to create the new one. It is, of course, a moment of, and they make no buts about it being a moment of Oedipal rage. And the success of New German cinema, I think, well into the early 1980s, was also a very strong argument. And of course, the cinema that came with New German cinema was one of authors. This notion of an international art cinema that critically reflected on Germany, that formally did a lot of things that were considered to be noteworthy, be they in terms of narrative structure, be they in terms, just in the way that one presented history and told stories, and somehow suggested that cinema didn't only have to tell stories to be worthy of itself as an enterprise. I think it took actually the wall opening up for one to look back, and actually, I think the most important moment there, I think, is to say, well, the cinema of authors has played itself out. It's a cinema of navel pickers. It's a cinema that only appeals to a very small number of people. Germany needs to have a healthy genre cinema if it is to be a viable film nation. And so that there became, I think, increasingly the cinema of authors and a kind of narrowly understood art cinema has come under very harsh criticism. And I think there is this desire to look back at German film history and to think about what it did right in terms of creating genres, popular genres that, in a sense, showed us lots of things that good films tend to do, show us, in a sense, more than perhaps the creators were wanting to. So it's, I think, part of the thing is it took a long time to disabuse oneself of a worship of author cinema. It took a long time to come around to say that actually a healthy genre cinema is a sign of a healthy film nation. And I think those were crucial, but I think the generational regard is also important. I mean, folks like myself, I needed to be prodded in a way, and I was not an easy sell. I mean, but this retrospective in 2016 at the Locarno Film Festival that was curated by Olaf Miller, who's going to be at the Film Archive here in November with a healthy, very healthy gathering of films that he's put together from the period. This really just made a stunning case. There's a 400-page catalog that came with it, and I read each page of there with the greatest of interest. And it's been translated into English as well.
Is this Beloved and Rejected?
Yeah, Beloved and Rejected is the English language title. Can strongly recommend it.
Well, thanks. I wanted to ask you as well, Amy. There are a couple of figures popped up in your talk who could also be seen as belonging to different generations. And I ask this because, to a certain extent, in the visual arts, I started to realize that to really think about the period, you had to think actually multi-generationally, right? So it wasn't just in the visual arts, it wasn't just the fathers, right? It was the pre-war generation that was still around and the emerging young generation to which, someone like Mary Bauermeister belongs, or obviously Stockhausen. But I liked that you brought in Schoenberg, even though, of course, he was in exile at the time. And I was hoping you could just expand a little bit on that conversation, because those sort of the dominance, I think, too, of this idea of serialism as kind of, being the only way and the kind of way to move away from everything that nobody wanted to kind of think about or talk about, seems to have really dominated in the music history. I mean, maybe I've only paid attention then to the birth of electronic music as opposed to other genres that are happening at the time.
Well, yeah, you do have to think about it multi-generationally, and I guess in writing this, I wanted to I was looking at the images in the catalog and thinking about this idea of abstraction in post-war music, and there is this sort of narrative that musicologists tell about why that aesthetic was so important, and that's part of what I recounted to you. But at the same time, as I was preparing, I picked up a book by a musicology colleague at Vanderbilt University who wrote a book on a survivor from Warsaw, and I was sort of, it falls within this period. It was written in America. It was actually premiered in Albuquerque, New Mexico, of all places. And then it went to Europe, and her book is about the reception of it. And I thought, wait a minute, here's a totally different story. And this piece is so powerful and does something completely different. And so I thought it would be interesting to not include it. It seemed to me to sort of deny something else that was happening, which was a reflection on the Holocaust and on the horror in music, not just in a lot of the visual art. But and then this idea of this stylistic language of Schoenberg, going back to the even pre-World War I, but certainly pre-World War II expressionism, that choice to go, even though the piece is 12-tone, it uses techniques that he actually developed in the 20s, it goes back to this earlier language. And before I came here, I was having coffee with a colleague in the music department here at Harvard, Ann Schreffler, who said, well, yeah, Schoenberg was born in the 1870s. His whole experience was different, and he was a romantic, and expressionism grew out of the romantic impulses of subjectivity. And so putting that in the context of post-war Darmstadt is really odd. And I mean, as I said, there's a whole book about the reception of that in that context. And I just thought it kind of made the story a little more messy than we tend to sort of tell when we're reducing these vast cultural movements. But the other thing is that 12-tone music was picked up on in places like Darmstadt because it had been banned. People wanted this Nachholbedürfnis. They wanted to learn about what they had missed. for those many years, but very soon after, there was sort of a rejection of that pre-war history in the famous moment when Pierre Boulez says, Schoenberg ist tot, and basically says, we don't want them. And they latched on to another composer of Schoenberg circles, Anton Webern, who wasn't a romantic expressionist, but was very much aesthetic. You know, his music was very abstract, even in the 20s. So yeah, it's complicated. I mean, anything, it's very hard.
Complicated, actually. But I was thinking, too, that, 1946 with the Neue Musik in Darmstadt, is that still, though, a kind of excitement about 12-tone music and the ability to actually, engage with it again after the Nazi period for a small, select group of musicians and creative thinkers. I mean, because when I think about the visual arts, they're making and creating and they're holding lectures and they're, but it still is within a very sort of small and, somewhat elite circle within, say, Berlin or in Munich. And even if the America Häuser are, presenting the work, and there is still quite a resistance to it on the part of the general public. And I was curious, how accepting was the public of this?
Well, that's a really huge topic. I mean, one thing I could say is that, yes, Darmstadt was a very small, and it was international, but at the beginning it was just really a couple Western European participants, has taken on an enormous historical significance that I was thinking when you were talking about how the art of this period has been sort of ignored. The German-produced art, it's sort of the opposite in music history, that we put so much emphasis on Darmstadt and Cologne and WDR and all of these things that happened to the, exclusion practically of everything else that was happening. Anyway, I mean, a little bit about the, radio in Paris, but it's really, it was canonized so strongly. And it's a really complicated question about whether or not the general public was interested in that, because one answer is the general public there was way more interested in anything experimental than they were here, which is part of what my research is about, American music in Germany. But there were also attempts to spread new music that was neoclassical or that was more accessible, and people didn't want it. It was seen as passé and derivative or whatever. So it kind of depends on the demographic you're looking at.
Right.
But the audience in general for experimental music was much larger there than here. And part of it had to do with the Bildungsauftrag, this effort to, and re-education, and not only a desire but a mandate to educate about things that were unknown during the Nazi era. And so there's a lot of different layers built into the cultural infrastructure that made this stuff way more present. And therefore, the more you encounter something, the more you're likely to be interested in it and maybe accept it. And that infrastructure was really unique, even in Western Europe.
And there was a similar strategy in the visual arts as well, the idea that the more exposure, and that was the argument for actually working together with industry and commercial design, was to, if you had the wallpaper in your apartment, you were going to be more open to the idea of abstraction than you would be if you weren't sort of encountering it in the sort of everyday circumstance. I wanted to ask you, Rick, and then I'll open it up to questions. It was so striking to me, the advertisements that you had shown, and which I have never seen before. And I love this idea of the facade and the rubble teeth and all of that. And I keep thinking, though, is it because those filmmakers could not actually sort of gain sort of holding in the film industry at the time because it was still dominated by the figures who had been more prominent before? Or, I mean, where is the distinction that while the Heimatfilm are being made on a larger scale, these sort of other filmmakers are doing or able to do such? I mean, is it an industry question? Is it a financial question? Or
I think a lot of younger film. I mean, one of the things about the films of the Adenauer era is that there aren't upcoming young filmmakers. It's a place that's lorded over by older people, and there's no way to find, no way to get into the film industry, and there are no really interesting. There are very, very few examples of people who are able to make films until the Oberhausen generation somehow manages to set up a scheme where the state will subsidize creative film work, so you no longer are beholden to the studios and to the conventions of studios. I mean, but there is this curious way in which you find there are places like the Bundesbahn, the German train service, make some marvelous modernist industrial films about velocity, films about communication. And the young Edgar Wrights, who can't make a feature, who will go on to make the film Heimat in 1984 that will make him internationally very famous, he gets his start making these kinds of films. And as a matter of fact, of the 26 people who signed the Oberhausen Manifesto, any number of them have been making commercials, have been making industrial films. I mean, one point I wanted to pick up on that I wasn't explicit enough about. I think when you're writing film history, you shouldn't just be looking at feature films. There are lots of different ways in which this medium somehow, takes place. And I think if you look at industrial film, a project I would love to give to a graduate student right now who's interested in media studies. Look at, let us say, all of these films that were made for Siemens by young filmmakers. Look at a film called The Magic Stripe, which is about tape recording technology, and it's done with the most kind of modernist of means. There are any number of films that are somehow reflecting on things like velocity, things like the media of communication, and they're doing so in very interesting ways. But if you're only looking at features, you're not even going to see them. But these films are not, hidden. You can get The Magic Stripe is available in its entirety in a subtitled copy on YouTube, for God's sakes. And there is a way in which I think the Locarno retrospective was so powerful because it didn't only show features, it showed documentaries, both short and long ones, and it showed advertisements. I mean, Durch Nacht zum Licht is something I came across in the Olaf Miller catalog. And I think film history is more than just feature film. That is surely one lesson I've learned here.
And I think we've seen tonight too with the dominant role that music also was playing in, both the commercial films but also the feature films, and many of the visual artists that are featured in the exhibition upstairs were also involved in film, photographers involved in film production, and artists who were then also, creating commercial design objects or participating in theater. I found less sort of direct connection to the music, which I think maybe because it was actually a very focused.
You mean with industry?
No, with the visual artists of the period actually then directly involved with the music production at the time.
It was really the Fluxus movement that had the bridge.
Which is
starting
later.
A little bit later. So starting around 1960, and people like Mary Bauermeister, who were in the art world, were really important. There were a lot of very, very experimental music performances and Fluxus performances took place in her space. But I did want to mention Siemens. The Siemens studio in Munich was also very important to the electronic music history. A lot of composers worked there, and a composer was, Bavarian composer who was very supportive of experimentation, was connected to the Siemens studio. So that was one of the few industry connections with my history.
And there's a very important dialogue, actually interactivity going on between the new music and these industrial and commercial films. Actually, you get that dramatized in the second Heimat by Edgar Reitz in 1992, where he's showing what it's like to be a young filmmaker in Munich in the late 50s and early 60s. And he's showing all of these all of these actually takes place in a music academy, right? And but you see people going to these performances of the new music, and you see these fledgling filmmakers learning from this music, actually using this music in their own films. I mean, Jonas is a very, very interesting example of a filmmaker, of a film that is, using electronic sound in interesting ways. And I would say it's not just a dialogue, it's a dialogue between the arts, because someone like Dominic in Jonas is also using a very prominent writer, Hans Magnus Enzensberger, to do the voiceover, to write the voiceover text for that film, so that you've got really cutting edge, art on various levels somehow converging in these films. And I think that's really a topic that would warrant, I think, some productive further exploration. The new music and young German film in the late 50s, early 60s.
And Dominic was a major collector and supporter of modern art, and in fact, two of the works by Fritz Winter that we have in the exhibition come actually from his collection outside of Stuttgart, because he was one of the major promoters of the work of abstract German artists at the time. So it's, it kind of sort of keeps on going. I want to make sure we have a few minutes to open it up. We'll start with Laura right here.
Thank you so much for this fantastic roundtable. And my question connects immediately to the last sentence, I think, that you said, Lynette. It's about Ottmar Dominic, who I've worked a lot about. And also, just to add to that, he, of course, was not only an art collector, but in the 50s, so before Jonas, he made two short films, which were artist films, one on Willy Baumeister, and the other one was called Neue Kunst, Neue Sehen, so new art, new vision. And I don't know enough about the soundtracks of these two films, but that could be an interesting thing to look at, because I wanted to precisely ask about what Rick said in the end. Where are the connections between the new music and the beginning new cinema at that moment, right? And I think I always thought that Jonas could be one of the first moments in which these two things are coming together, because it was composed by a student of Arnold Schoenberg, Winfried Zillig. It was composed as a 12-tone composition, and Rick already pointed to the fact that many other things are coming into the soundtrack, right? The voice of Enzensberger and so forth. If we trace the films of Dominic further, one of his next films, called Without Date, was another collaboration with a composer, Roman Haubenstock-Ramati. So he begins to work with pioneers of electronic music. He begins to work with students of Stockhausen who knew his films and talked about his films. This film that followed Jonas was actually shown at the Donau-Eschingen Music Days. It was received there as a contribution to new music, although it was shown in the medium of film. So I was interested in the connections between your two talks, and now I think you just opened a new avenue to look at industrial film and to look at Siemens as probably a site where we find the connection pre-Jonas, where I always thought maybe that's where the connection starts. So maybe just to hear some more words from you about the interconnections, or maybe also from Amy, if you know about any experiments or crossovers between film and new music in the 50s.
I don't really. I mean, not in terms of German cinema specifically. I do know that shortly after the advent of synthesized sound, it became quite popular to use it in science fiction. Forbidden Planet was a very famous example of one of the first uses of electronic music in film. I think it's striking in these that the examples you showed that electronic music or atonal music is often taken out of its sort of abstract musical context and put in a context that's filled with angst and crazy, weird nightmares and things like that. And so I think that's just sort of an interesting aesthetic trend in this time, that it's otherworldly, fear-inducing often. But I personally have not done research on that, but.
Yeah, no, I mean, Laura, I guess the larger question is, and I think this is also, I find a question that's answered by what you found. I mean, I think for the longest time there was this somehow dominant persuasion that modernism gets lost in post-war Germany, that somehow it really takes until the 60s and takes until the kind of international influence of work being done in New York, around the world. I mean, in a way that the Germany of the 50s is so provincial, I think, in the dominant persuasion, because it is so, I mean, it's very much in keeping with the one of the advertising slogans for one of the Adenauer campaigns, kind of experimente, no experiments, right? That seems to hold in the aesthetic realm as well. And I think the kind of work you're doing, the kind of work I think that Olaf Miller and his retinue did, I think are making very clear that there's an awful lot of modernism there. And I think obviously the kind of work you're doing, Amy, I mean, there is a way in which the new music was modernist. It was, I think, embattled in Germany, to say the very least. It had a much, if I'm not mistaken, I think a much more enthusiastic following abroad than it did at home, or not?
You mean during the 50s?
Yeah.
Ask me later.
Yeah.
I haven't encountered that in my research, but I also wasn't looking for that. I was looking for sort of the reverse.
Yeah. Well, I mean, in any event, actually, the Bauhaus is a whole interesting kind of case here as well, because the Bauhaus is very much on people's minds. As a matter of fact, when the young German filmmakers, get the wherewithal to establish a film academy in Ulm, they create this film academy in Ulm in the early 1960s, and it is staffed by former members of the Bauhaus. It is organized along the lines of the pedagogy of the Bauhaus. So that legacy is still very much alive. In a way, it gains a kind of sort of second wind, or a third wind, as it were, in this guise. But I think that notion of the Adenauer era having far more experimental activity than we would think, and far more modernism than has, I think, been otherwise, otherwise the case when we read film histories or even social histories of art from the period. I mean, that's I think for me a major new point of departure.
Here. Okay. All right. Last one.
Right. Well, first of all, thanks for the program. The scholarship that's gone into this series has just been remarkable, so thank you.
Oh, thank you.
So I want to hang my question on this appearance by John Cage and David Tudor in Darmstadt in 1954.
58.
58, right.
They went to Donaueschingen in 54.
So Cage, his primary emphasis was to introduce the concept of the practice of indeterminacy into music, which is a way of allowing the world into composition. This seems to me to be completely opposite of what was going on in Darmstadt at the time. So, I mean, can you comment on that? I mean, what was it? I mean, in this idea of allowing the world in versus keeping the world out?
Well, the allowing the world in part of Cage was really sort of a small part of what he did. And what he was really doing from around 1950 on was developing a compositional procedure called chance operations, whereby he actually did exactly what the serialists were doing. He separated pitch from rhythm, from dynamics, from articulation, and then recombined them. The method of recombination was very different between what the Americans were doing and what the Europeans were doing. And so, but the oral effect was very much the same, that any kind of continuities or connections our ears would normally make are obliterated. And so the music is similarly sort of abstract and confusing. And so when Cage and Tudor came to, especially to Darmstadt, there was sort of a big uproar that he was creating music that sounded very much like the music that Boulez and Stockhausen and others were creating, but he had done it by rolling dice and doing other things. So they sort of thought he was making a mockery of their very scientific mathematic methods, but it was just a different method. And there's a very interesting book called the Boulez-Cage Correspondence, which is a reprinting of their correspondence around 1950 when they were each developing these new methods of composition, and they were talking about it in great detail, and they were sympathetic to each other's ideas. But a couple of years later, everybody just said, wait a minute, this is, and then at that point in 1958, the German new music community or the European new music community sort of split off into people who just completely rejected Cage's ideas and the people who just jumped on that bandwagon. And the interesting thing about the cultural infrastructure in Germany is that even if people hated Cage, they were on the radio talking about him, they were writing about him extensively. So he was in everybody's eyes and ears all the time, which has a great, bad publicity is, what is the phrase?
There's no such thing.
No such thing as bad publicity. So he became, very famous and very influential. But it's a good question. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, well, I think we have to stop. Unless, Greg, you seemed sort of disappointed that we were... You want one last one?
If there's time.
Yes, okay. Let's let Greg, he seemed very disappointed. It better be good now.
I was going to say,
No,
be a really
well,
good
yeah, now
question.
the pressure's
Make us all
on.
stay.
It's not that complicated. I'll try and keep it really short. This is more of a question for you, Lynette. And one of the things that your show made very vivid to me was the tension in the post-war period between a kind of, on the one hand, the recuperation of rigorous, modernist, formal visual language, aka abstraction, and at the same time, the attempt to make that kind of imagery palatable for a much larger public and to kind of produce an audience that would ultimately become a very middle-class kind of middle-brow audience, to put it in, maybe more negative terms. And this is something that Zygmunt Polke would parody and comment on, and it was a very visible concept for him in the early to mid-1960s. And so I wonder if you could just talk a little bit more about that tension in the 50s, in the Adenauer era, vis-a-vis the two audiences, I suppose, for this kind of work, the more elite, sort of initiated audience versus the larger audience that they were trying to kind of develop at the time.
I think it's not so dissimilar to what Rick was describing in film as well, is that I think initially when we've looked at that period, we've assumed, like Polka did as well, right, that there is this kind of middle-class bourgeois, sort of, palatable, and that's sort of West German abstraction, sort of writ large, right? So, it began to be hung in, people's homes, even if they didn't really understand it, and, all these kinds of things. And when I started looking at that period as well, I found actually a lot of moments of almost sort of self-reflective moments made by the artists themselves about what they were actually participating in or what actually those perceptions were at the time. So one great example in the exhibition is a photograph by Otto Steinert, who's been, sort of touted as the, the leader of what's called the subjective photography movement, and we often think of that as this kind of abstracted details, multiple exposures, really playing with the sort of photographic language. And the work in the exhibition, A Still Life from 1955, looks almost like it could have been made by Sigmar Polke a decade later. It's this kind of sterile environment, sort of constructed, staged, sort of still life, and with the wallpaper and the background and this whole thing. And I started realizing myself, once you start to look beyond maybe the works that, if you look at work on Steiner, right, you always get sort of the same images. You sort of always get that kind of repetition of the same work. So sort of looking slightly askance, right, or looking back maybe to someone like Schoenberg, whose work was actually being produced or shown or heard. I'm sorry, I'm so used to the visual realm in Germany, right? That then we can maybe start to complicate some of those long-standing assumptions, but. Thanks, Greg. All right, well, thank you everyone for coming tonight. Thank both of our guests for actually helping us expand our understanding of this period in Germany, and I hope this is just the beginning of much more. And please join us at the Harvard Film Archive. It's the weekend of April 20th. 20th to 23rd, we'll be showing the 5 films that Professor Rentschler selected, thinking about the themes of the Inventur exhibition. And you got a snippet of Jonas tonight, and I encourage you all to come out for those. It's really a fantastic opportunity to see more of the film of the period. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.